One of the questions I get a lot as a biblical scholar and theologian is, what would happen to people's faith if there was proof, genuine proof, really incontrovertible proof of an extraterrestrial reality? What would that really change for people? This question was actually one of the centerpiece elements to my novel, The Facade. Could Christianity really accommodate a genuine extraterrestrial reality or disclosure? The question is actually pretty old, even though we kind of think that it might be a modern one because, space travel, the whole question of, aliens and alien visitation seems to be new to us. But it actually goes back centuries and even millennia. As far as our current day, when it comes to the church, really the church's perspective, or even people's perspective about how the believing church would act, there have been 3 surveys that sort of kind of steer the discussion. One is the Brookings report that was done in 1960. This was an official report done in the Beltway in the D.C. area, and it was really about the implications of peaceful space activities on human affairs. That's the way it was cast. But in the survey, there was discussion about, what if we run across proof in our own space program, through that program, that there was intelligent extraterrestrial life out there. And the Brookings report had a negative conclusion. It really, was pretty dire. It was pretty depressing, actually. It concluded that, for sure, disclosure would have very disruptive effects on human society. And so Brookings became kind of a touch point for a negative view of contact. Now, a few decades later, something called the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey was conducted. This was around 1994. And that actually reached a more positive conclusion. The focus was religious people, mainline denominations mostly, Christianity, Judaism, even Islam. And that report really sort of produced the answer, well, not so much. Most people of faith, this really wouldn't rattle them. And that was followed by another survey in 2008, the Peters ETI, which stands for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. The Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. And that kind of, proposed the same thing, that this really wouldn't be that big of a deal. Now, in my own opinion, I don't think that the surveys really address the most pressing question because it really doesn't target the people who would actually tend to be the most rattled by this. And that is what we might call conservative Christians or Jews. Jews that would, take the Torah, again, as, the inspired word of God, every word of it, and be really, closely conservative in following the content of the Torah. The same way that for Christians, they might call themselves Bible believers. Again, very literalistic in their approach. The Alexander survey, the Peters survey, doesn't really target those kinds of people, those kinds of Christians. They really target kind of mainliners, which tend to be theologically kind of liberal. So I would question the results of this. And frankly, I think it really would cause problems with certain Christians if there was a genuine ET reality, but it doesn't have to. It would cause problems because there are some people, who would look at the Bible and say things like, hey, if it's not in the Bible, it can't be real. The Bible is an exhaustive, accurate record of everything that's happened or really needs to be thought about when it comes to creation and who humans are and what life is. Some would say that, hey, if there are aliens out there, then that kind of makes the image of God kind of pointless. Humans wouldn't be unique anymore. What about, would Jesus have to go die on that other planet where those aliens were and be incarnate there and, do something like the cross for their salvation? Questions like that come up. And some people would just say, well, I don't really want there to be aliens because they must just be demons or something like that. So theological conservatives, this is often kind of the thing that goes through their minds when you bring up the question of the extraterrestrial. For sure, if you're kind of more liberal in your thinking, or if you really, again, haven't processed the Bible in these sorts of ways, you'd probably be fine with it. But there are a lot of people in the church, in Christian circles, that do think on these terms and do process their Bible this way. They do think these sorts of thoughts. And for those folks, a genuine extraterrestrial reality would be troublesome. But I'll go back to my original thought. It really doesn't have to be. And so I've actually spent a good bit of time thinking about this to try to help people who are very conservative theologically process the whole question a little bit better. Are these fears really legitimate? How are we thinking about the Bible, or how should we? Does it matter? Would it matter in terms of, if there are aliens out there, would it prove something different about human origins than what the Bible says? Something evolutionary or maybe even worse. What about the image of God? What about the atonement? Do aliens have to be understood as demons? All these sorts of things matter, again, for a significant wing of the church. And I think we need to just process things a little bit better. But before we can do that, we kind of have to have a little perspective on how the question has been talked about among serious Christians over the centuries. When it comes to Bible-believing Christians, again, and that would be the way they think of themselves, the whole question of whether there could be ET, alien life, intelligent alien life, has sort of tilted toward the negative in current times. It wasn't always like this, though. Some of the baggage that the question has, again, they must be demons. This sort of ruins the creation story. It impinges on the image of God. All these sorts of things were really not part of the discussion of other worlds and alien life early in Christian history. The question actually goes back to Greek and Latin antiquity. You're going to find Greek philosophers like the atomists in the 3rd and 4th century AD that were very pro when it came to this question. They thought very highly of the idea that there could be other worlds, and of course, on those other worlds you could have intelligent beings. There were also major naysayers in the Greco-Roman world, like Plato and Aristotle. And since most early Christian thinkers were either following Plato or Aristotle in their philosophical thinking and how they applied that to theology, a lot of early Christian thinkers were negative because of Plato and Aristotle, again, following their thought on this, following their lead. Augustine, or as some people would say, Augustine of Hippo, a very influential church father, rejected the idea of other worlds. Partly again because he's following Platonic philosophy in the way he parses the whole question. And his influence was so powerful and so dominant in the early church that for Christians, again, they would sort of just follow his lead. Now that changed in the Middle Ages. You had sort of a shift. You have a fellow named John Buridan, who lived in the late 1200s and the 1300s at the University of Paris, and he believed that there certainly was more than one world because of God's omnipotence. Of course, God could do that. He could make other worlds with other intelligent beings on them. A contemporary theologian, a fellow named Aquinas, whose influence was considerably greater than Buridan's, again, which one of those two have you heard of, rejected the idea of other worlds. Aquinas did so on the basis of what he called his argument for and from perfection. That was the idea that perfection for Aquinas, again in his talk about God and God's world and his creation, perfection was to be found only in unity. And so he thought that all things can be unified only in one single perfect world. And so he rejected the idea that there are other worlds. Again, it sounds a bit esoteric to us, but this is how people talked about it. Also in the late 1200s, a bishop of Paris, Tempier, issued a condemnation of doctrines that seemed to set limits on God's omnipotence. And this was sort of a turning point, because Buridan had argued that other worlds should be recognized because God is omnipotent. And when you had sort of theological watchdogs saying that we can't hold ideas that are contrary to omnipotence, this led to something in theology called the principle of plenitude, which was sort of latched onto in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And this was the idea that, well, of course there could be other worlds because an omnipotent creator must of necessity bring to be all that is possible to sort of glorify himself. And so this shift that of course there are other worlds because God is omnipotent. And if God's omnipotent, he's going to do omnipotent things. It actually led to the thinking that in terms of Christian theology, other worlds aren't just possible, but maybe we should believe in them, or maybe we have to believe in them, or else we impinge upon an omnipotent God, his ability. And that principle, again, this principle of plenitude or fullness, really took off and sort of won the day when you get into the Renaissance and the early modern period. It became the touch point for how Christians thought about other worlds. It was very positive, but it didn't stay that way. Some other things happened historically to sort of sour the whole question in the minds of many churchgoers. Now, a positive view of the extraterrestrial question for the church really lived on until the late 19th century. So when you get out of the Enlightenment and into the early modern period, again, what we would think of as modern, by that time, most of the consensus, really the consensus of the church, was this was a positive thing. That, of course, based upon the idea of plenitude, God's fullness, his full power, his omnipotence, God could have created other worlds and, of course, put intelligent beings on those worlds. Now, there were some bumps along the way, along the road toward that consensus. For instance, Thomas Paine is very familiar with the American Revolution. Paine was one of the few founders that was an atheist, very antagonistic toward Christianity, and one of his arguments against Christianity actually came from the other worlds question. He would say, well, this whole idea about God's omnipotence in other worlds is ridiculous because if it was true and God did this, then Jesus would have to go and incarnate on all these other worlds and die multiple deaths and so on and so forth. So he actually used this question about Jesus needing to incarnate and die on crosses and all these other places as an argument against Christianity. He used the principle of plenitude and the church's acceptance of other worlds against it. It just sort of shows you again how popular and how widespread the receptiveness toward other worlds was for Paine to be able to use that as an argument against Christianity. But again, generally speaking, by the 19th century, this was the consensus. There were people who responded to Thomas Paine, very famous preachers. Timothy Dwight, who was the president at Yale, a very well-known believer, Bible believer. Thomas Chalmers, very well-known Scottish preacher, both responded to Paine's arguments and the arguments of others to defend the idea that there were certainly other worlds and other intelligent beings on those worlds. So when you get into a discussion like this and you start discovering things like this, the way Christians, serious Christians, theologians, preachers, used to talk about whether there could be extraterrestrials, whether there could be alien life forms that were intelligent, and have it be very positive, even an element of talking about the attributes of God in a coherent way. You compare that with the discussion now, where a lot of Christians are fearful and reactionary toward the idea. You have to ask yourself the question, well, what happened? What happened in the late 19th century that has affected our thinking about this all the way into the current period? Well, there were a few things that happened, and they really have affected dramatically the whole posture of the church toward this question.